Hey humans! So today we're going to talk about Paleolithic Vermonters, or as I'm going to call them, Paleo Vermonters. These are the first people who ever lived in the place that we call Vermont. And we're going to discuss how they interacted with the landscape here when it was very different than it is today. Vermont looked very different about 10,000 years ago than it does now. But before we get going, I just want to start with a few basic terms. And you'll notice that I wrote a few terms for your notes here. And this is just a strategy to help you keep track of big issues or ideas that I'm going to bring up throughout the next 30 or so minutes. I'm going to give you a lot of information, and one of the skills that we want you to learn is how to decide which information is actually most important. So you can follow these terms as a way of doing that. Okay, let's start with this first term, this prefix paleo. What does that mean? What does that actually signify? Um, and basically, it just means old, right? It's ancient Greek for old. Um, in this case, we use it to refer to people who lived about 11,000 years ago, around 9,000 BC. Um, and I want to give you some perspective on how long ago this was. Okay, so I'm going to use other points in history to kind of help us make sense of this, similar to what we did with the geologic timeline. Okay, so Paleo Vermont, everything I'm about to talk about, going from 9,000 to 7,000 BC, or 9,000 to 11,000 years ago, right? Because we're 2000 AD, 2020. Um, let's think about this. So, ancient Rome, I've got the Colosseum here in the corner. Looking at about 2,000 years ago, it was at its height. Ancient Greece, perhaps 2,500 or 2,500 years ago, and then ancient Egypt, as characterized by its most famous site, the pyramids, 4,500 years ago. So you think about ancient Egypt is only about half of the time between us and Paleo Vermonters. That's how long ago we're talking. And yet, as we saw with the geologic timeline, in the span of the history of the world itself, it's really not far at all, right? It's almost like it's yesterday. And in fact, Paleo Vermonters, genetically speaking, were essentially the same as modern people. Okay, so try to give yourself a little bit of perspective as we go. One important thing to think about is, what did Vermont look like so long ago? Because although people, genetically speaking, haven't changed actually all that much, the landscape has changed dramatically. Okay, so let's think about some paleo-humans in the natural world. Vermont, so long ago, was a mix of tundra and scrubby spruce parkland. It looked kind of like parts of today you would see in Alaska, or northern Alberta, right? Parts of northern Canada. Um, it was at the very edge of a great ice sheet that covered much of the continent and was slowly receding. Um, and also, Vermont, parts of Vermont were a seacoast. Okay, as glaciers receded, they left behind a sea. It's called the Champlain Sea. That's what geologists call it. It doesn't exist anymore, of course. Um, and it was connected in part to what is known today as the Champlain Valley, Lake Champlain in northern Vermont. It's probably the most famous place in Vermont today. Okay, but at the time it was connected to the Atlantic Ocean. Um, Vermont was a very open environment. It was an ideal environment for large game animals called megafauna. Um, some of these are animals that still live in North America, like wolves and deer and caribou. And some of them are animals that have been extinct for a long time, like mammoths um, and mastodons. Okay. How did Paleo Vermonters survive in such a place? And here's the Champlain Sea. If you're still trying to get a sense of your geography of where we are, so this, there's like a little arm that juts down below Montreal, right, which is in Canada. It's north of us, of course. Um, and that is the Champlain Valley. This is Lake Champlain here today, modern Lake Champlain. So we are just south and east of where this saltwater sea was. Okay. How did Paleo Vermonters survive? And when we talk about this, what we're talking about is the idea of subsistence. And subsistence means the actions, the traditions by which a people sustain their livelihood, right? By which they survive, right? How a people keeps themselves alive. And to understand subsistence, really what you're asking is how did a people interact with their natural world, right? Because people don't survive without taking somehow from the world around them. And this relationship between people and their natural world is the basis not only of foodways or something like a hunting tradition or an agricultural tradition, but it's also the basis often of political arrangements and economic arrangements and religious belief and all sorts of other things. It's really the foundation of human culture. Okay. We can't say a lot specifically about Paleo Vermonters' culture because we just don't have enough evidence, but we can say how, most basically, how they interacted with their natural world, which was that they hunted, right? And they hunted these megafauna that I was just talking about. They had the ability to hunt very, very large animals, mastodons, mammoths, caribou. Um, and they also likely, although there's not that I've ever found any specific evidence that can tell us this, they very likely hunted along the Champlain Sea, right? That means that the earliest Vermonters would have been able to hunt things like whales, porpoises, seals, perhaps walrus, certainly fish from right here in Vermont. Okay, and when I say fish, of course, I mean saltwater fish, right? This is ocean fishing. Again, we don't really know for sure that early Vermonters were able to do any of that fishing. We are very convinced that they were excellent hunters, however, and we know this because their tools that they have left behind tell us the story. The most common artifacts that we've found connected to these people are their tools. Okay, their tools are often very sharp, like knives or spear points. And we've also found these tools at campsites that tend to be on higher ground. Okay, and that would suggest that early Vermonters, Paleo Vermonters, staked out high land so that they could overlook these scrubby park-like wooded areas and get a good view of animals that they were trying to hunt. Okay. All right, let's move on. Here's some examples of some of the tools that I was just talking about. This is from one of the larger early Paleo-American sites that's ever been discovered. These were discovered in the 1960s in Montana. And very similar objects have been discovered here in Vermont, but for some reason Vermonters have struggled to take high quality photos of artifacts that they've discovered. And so we go with photos from other places. What else can we say about Paleo Vermonters based on this very little bit of evidence we have? I mean, think about what I just showed you. This is not a lot to go with if you want to describe a civilization, right? A culture, how a people really lived. And yet, it's enough to tell us where their food likely came from. It's enough to tell us as well how they moved about the world, because we know from studying other hunting people throughout human history that hunters don't tend to stay put, which means that Paleo Vermonters were likely moving around a lot. They had a clear home area, but that home area could be huge. It could extend all the way from modern day New York City up to Lake Champlain, depending on where animals were going, depending on how animals were migrating. They didn't, like people we know today in the world, most people that we know of in the world today. Um, Paleo-Americans and Paleo-Vermonters more specifically did not carry their means of subsistence with them. They did not carry the things they needed to survive with them. Instead, they had to go in search of it constantly. And a people that has a need that like that, right? If your subsistence has you constantly in search of the means of survival, then you will know the land very, very intimately. You have to. If you don't, you won't be able to feed yourself or your family or your tribe, right? So you have to know the landscape really well, which means that in these large cycles of migration um, that Paleo Vermonters would have seasonally, likely seasonally traveled, they would know places that we would think of as very far apart from one another, um, as we might know our backyard, right? Um, why did any of this matter for Vermont? Well, Paleo Americans probably came to Vermont very gradually, right? Vermont is one of the last places in what we think of as the continental United States, the lower 48 states, to be uncovered from ice, right? The ice was slowly, slowly receding, which means that the first people who ever came here likely slowly entered the region, and more as the ice went further and further back, and animals were increasingly migrating into this land. Okay, so they came here compared to other places in North America, probably pretty late. This is just kind of an interesting aside, but for those of you who've studied American history before, sometimes we think of, because we have a European-centric understanding of the history of North America, right? That's what's most commonly taught in our schools. That's what we most commonly hear on TV and in movies. We tend to think of history as moving from east to west. And you can walk around a place like Vermont and you see these really old houses. And then maybe someday you get a chance and you go to California and you see everything looks new. And it reinforces this idea that old is east and new is west. But actually, in the human history of North America, it's the opposite. And where we are now is one of the last places that people made it. And people were initially in their great migration from Asia, which was thousands of years before even the Paleo Vermonters, right? They were in what we think of as the American West. Okay, so Paleo Vermonters, first Vermonters, but they came here late compared to other places. And they had to be very flexible, right? And this is important for any people who are foraging, any people who are trying to live on what the land can provide for them, right? They have to adapt themselves to new environments that are changing very rapidly. And they have to prepare to shift which environment they're going to survive from based on where animals are, what the condition of a landscape is, perhaps what other people are doing, right? As other people are also migrating, they might find themselves in conflict and have to move around. Okay, so flexibility is sort of the name of the game for the first people who ever lived in Vermont. This is really different than agriculturalist and industrialist human societies, right? So we live in an industrialist human society today, which means we're hyper fixed to place, but we can also like move really quickly around the world because we have combustion engines and things like that that can help us travel really quickly. So we're globalized, and our means of subsistence are often really tied to the ground, just like agriculturalist society. If you're a farmer, you're locked into your place, and it's very hard to constantly migrate. Okay, so this is a different way of living than most modern societies. And when I say modern, that is those that have dominated the world over the last 500 plus years have experienced. Okay, where did Paleo Vermonters come from? They likely came up the river valleys, most likely the Hudson River Valley, down from what we think of today as New York City, all the way up to Lake Champlain. It's also very likely that they came up the Connecticut River Valley, right where we live. Um, Also from a lower lying area down in what we think of today as southern Connecticut, as well as in the greater New York area. These are like highways, right? Low lying areas that would have led them into the highlands, the mountain lands where we are today. Okay, yeah, one last thing. Because of the issue of migration, I'm calling them Paleo Vermonters because I'm biased towards Vermont, but it's very likely that Paleo Vermonters were also Paleo New Yorkers, Paleo Canadians, Paleo New Hampshireites, et cetera, because they weren't recognizing the arbitrary political boundaries of contemporary Vermont. How did such a society end? The Paleo Vermonter era ended probably around 7000 BC. And what ended it was that the planet was changing. The natural world was changing. The world was getting warmer. The glaciers were receding. And as they receded, the forests grew thicker. They were beginning to grow into the forests that would look similar to what we see today, which means it's really hard for like a woolly mammoth to move around in the forest like we have here on the Putney School campus, which meant that more and more of these large megafauna were either dying out or they were migrating further north with the ice and the tundra. And so this changed the structure of life. Paleo Vermonters had to change, and they couldn't be big game hunters anymore. Instead, they started to subsist on vegetation and smaller game animals, which changed the way they hunted, which changed the way they migrated. Basically, everything about their life would have changed. And this is very slow. This is happening over thousands of years, um, but it's fundamentally altering who they were as a people. Okay. Um, so, all of what I just said, I imagine, sounds very convincing to you. I hope it does. But if it doesn't, that's totally fine, right? Because I want you to think about how we know any of what I just said. I've been talking now for, I don't know how long, maybe it's 15 minutes or something like that. And there's no reason necessarily for you to believe anything that I've just said, right? The trick is that we have to go from very imperfect evidence when we're talking about people who lived so long ago, right? So I'm coming from the world of history, and historians like it when things are written down. But nothing was written down by the Paleo Vermonters, right? So now it's not necessarily history that we're doing. Now we're moving more into science. We're moving into archaeology. We're moving into genetics, things like this, very complex, sophisticated stuff to try and understand little fragments of information that might tell us a bigger picture story about people who are so inaccessible to us, right? So what is this little bit of evidence that we have? Well, usually it comes from random artifacts that are found in the ground at random. Okay, these are objects that humans would have used. Occasionally, very occasionally, there are human remains that are this old that are discovered. I'm going to talk about those in a second. And these things are preserved in the soil. There's one very famous example of this happening in Vermont, a site like this being uncovered. It's called the Regan site in far northern Vermont. And this was back in the 1920s. What was uncovered there were fire-cracked rocks, right? Rocks that had been exposed to extreme heat, which suggested that people had used hearths, fireplaces, both to keep warm and perhaps to cook meat. There were hundreds of tools discovered that looked exactly like the ones I'm showing you here. They were carved from stone. They were used either as hunting implements or for scraping, like scraping flesh from a pelt, right? And they were, these spear points could be attached, as you can see, there's this, this is called fluting, how there's like a little indentation at the bottom of all of these so that these could be attached to spears or turned into spears, right? And as with the artifacts of any distant culture, the Regan site reveals to us some really important outlines for how people lived, right? We know that they hunted. These are hunting implements. We can say that very convincingly. Um, and we know that hunting people migrate because animals migrate. And we can say that very convincingly, right? We can say that that's a safe thing to say about Paleo Vermonters. And we know that they gathered in shelters, right? We have these cracked rocks. We can begin to make claims about how they might have congregated together. And we know that these places tend to be in similar spaces, right? Slight highlands, as I said before, elevated above the land, good for hunting, good for observing animals. Um, about 20 of these sites have been found in Vermont since. Most of them are in the Champlain Valley, which means they were likely near the Champlain Sea when it was ocean water filled with ocean wildlife. Um, there's not many of these sites, however, in Vermont compared to some other places. And so what scientists who want to understand early Vermont have to do is they have to draw conclusions from artifacts found in other places. And sometimes those places are really close to here. Um, Across the river in New Hampshire, not far from here, only about 20 miles from here, there's been uncovered evidence of Paleo-American presence that goes back 9,000 years. Another example in Keene, New Hampshire, which is very close to here, called the Tennant Swamp, has been dated at 12,500 years. And there's also sites in Massachusetts and in New York. And so we can draw from these different bodies of evidence to get a sense of how people would have lived in Vermont. And if you're wondering, well, why is there so many more sites discovered in other places? One explanation could be that Vermont, as one of the lowest population states in America, just has less development. And usually this evidence comes from development, right? Someone's building a home, or they're building a school, or they're building a business, or they're building a road or a bridge or something like that. And they uncover accidentally one of these sites, right? So perhaps it's because Vermont is, relative to the rest of the United States, fairly undeveloped land, that fewer of these sites have been uncovered. But that's just a hypothesis. All of these things are under the broad umbrella of what's called Clovis culture. And Clovis is named for a city in New Mexico where early examples of these remains were found. This was again around the 1920s. And the hallmark is this tool, right? What's called the fluted point. And so these have been found all over North America, as far south as Venezuela. So this was a wide-ranging relationship between people and their land, the age of the big game hunters. That's what Paleo Vermonters were a part of. Okay, now I want to, so that's basically how we know. Okay, that's the best that we can do for now. And there are certainly people in the world who can explain all of these things in even more hyper detail. But those are the broad outlines. But I want to raise one final question as we wrap up here, which is, who cares? Okay, look at these rocks. Why do these things matter at all? Why is this important? To what extent does it have anything to do with the world that we live in today? Well, let's think through a few possible answers. One thing is that the story of Paleo Vermonters, or the story of Paleo Americans, can actually tell us a lot about how people have interacted with land at different times. And that's always a lesson that we want to think about, right? Like all Clovis people, Paleo Vermonters' way of life became impossible as the glaciers receded, as forests developed, as large game animals disappeared. And that meant that other aspects of life, from how people fed themselves to how they moved around, had to change too. And so the big picture there is, changes in the land mean changes in the people, right? So that's a good lesson, but we can learn that lesson from lots of different societies across human history, right? This is just one more chapter in that story. So I think there's even more important reasons to study and think about the earliest people that have ever been in Vermont as well as in North America. Let's think about those. One is a very important, pressing contemporary question, which is who can claim the land, right? Who owns the land? Who has a title to the land? And we decide this question um, through many different avenues, all right? But one of the ways we can do that is by thinking about who was here first, right? Who was here first is a really important question. It's a question of ethics, right? We can use evidence of who was here first to say what is right in a given dispute over land. If your people can trace their roots here back 12,000 years, and your people can only trace their roots back here 100 years, they were here first. That's a good foundation for an ethical debate about who has claim to the land, right? But it's not just a question of ethics, right? This isn't just like an academic question for the classroom. This is actually a question of law and money and power, about who really gets access to the land, which is the basic, again, foundation of how we provide for ourselves in this society, right? Native Americans have, a number of different tribes have, for many years successfully argued in courts that their claims to the land precede all others, right? And not all courts in this country or in others are sympathetic to those arguments, but it has proven to be a winning strategy at various points, right? So it's really important to understand these very distant societies because it can help us understand the lineage of people who've been here going back now thousands of years. Okay. But this is dangerous, right? And this has been very controversial for a long time because the opposite side of what I'm saying could also be true, right? If for some reason Paleo-American people were proven to not be related to contemporary Native American people, then opportunistic people, governments, businesses, etc., could say Native people have no claim to the land, right? They cannot say that their claim is as legitimate. They were just immigrants here like anybody else, and it is the relatives of these skeletons that are 12,000 years old that are the true inheritors of the land. And because they're not around, this is a moot point, and I should get the land because I want it, right? And everything I'm saying right now is sort of a summary of many arguments that other people have made. So it's really important for us to understand who is here first and to begin to try and draw connections between those people and contemporary people. And it's also really kind of a dangerous thing to do because contemporary claims to land can depend on it. There are a couple of examples of this happening. The oldest human remains found in North America, they're 12,700 years old, were discovered with I'll show you these tools here in Montana in the 1960s, and it was a skull of a 3-year-old child, and that child has now been genetically linked to Native people in contemporary Central and South America, as well as to dozens of different Native tribes throughout North America, right? So this child is related to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who were alive today, and helps those people make a claim to the land that they live on in North America and Central America and South America today. So that's all one issue. Another issue comes back to the difference between fact and opinion that we talked about last week. And this is the last thing I'm going to say, I promise, and then you're going to be done with this. But as I was saying last week, facts are indisputable observations, right? And they can only change when we develop new tools for making observations. But beliefs can't necessarily be argued with based on facts alone, right? Beliefs exist in another realm of human knowledge, and they're transmitted, they're shared through tradition. They come down through the ages. And sometimes when you uncover things that are 12,000 years old, or when you uncover, in particular, human remains that are 12,000 years old, you end up in that sticky ground between wanting to know more facts and conflicting with beliefs that are really important, right? And this is a culturally sensitive place to be. And this is what has happened as more and more Paleo-American sites have been uncovered. I'm going to give you an example of one of these. This example comes from Kennewick, Washington, where the remains of a man who lived 9,000 years ago were discovered in 1996. And this man is sometimes called the Kennewick Man, and native people in the Northwest, they call him the Ancient One. Okay. And this was a very controversial issue because scientists hypothesized that the Kennewick Man, or the Ancient One, was not actually related to Native Americans. They thought that he was connected to contemporary inhabitants of Japan. And they wanted to make an argument that he had, or not he, but his ancestors, his people, had come to North America by boat, not over a land bridge. And native people in the Northwest were extremely frustrated by these developments. They claimed that he was an ancestor, that he should be buried and treated with the respect of an ancestor, and that arguments that he could be traced back to people who were not Native American were wrong and violated their core beliefs that they inhabited the land from time immemorial, right? Here is what a spokesperson for the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla, which is an indigenous nation in northeastern Oregon, here is how they framed this issue. They said, "From our oral histories, we know that our people have been part of this land since the beginning of time. We do not believe that our people migrated here from another continent as the scientists do." And they said that these remains were theirs, and it didn't necessarily matter what scientists thought they were proving because they were wrong, and the belief was the accurate form of knowledge. And there was real issues on the line here. They were worried as well that if for some reason the Kennewick Man's DNA was not connected to them, that they could lose their title to their land. They could potentially lose their homeland, right? The stakes were really, really high. In the end, against the wishes of most of the tribes, his DNA was tested. He is related to a number of different tribes that are in the Northwest today, right? So the Kennewick Man, the Ancient One, is a Native American, right? And this leads to a growing body of evidence that Paleo Americans were the descendant, or were the ancestors of contemporary Native Americans, which has helped a number of Native American groups prove their tenure on the land that goes back thousands of years, and that their beliefs are rooted in what scientists would call facts. Okay, that's all I've got. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon.